Hello, I'm Tom Brassington, a PhD student in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University, and this is the second part of the Writing and Rhetorical Skills workshop, which focuses on the whole essay and provides some closing advice at the end. The first part of the video focused on sentence structure and language, sentence and paragraph structure and language, and the thinking about the local level of writing skills, whereas this is going to be more focused on the global level of the entire essay as a whole, the global sort of level of writing. This session is designed to help develop your written and rhetorical abilities, since English as a subject is all about exercising your abilities to argue. Most essays involve you as a writer presenting a case for reading a text or part of one in a certain way. Skills-wise, this requires you to have a good ability for analysing a text, thinking creatively and critically about a text, and expressing your ideas in a convincing manner. This workshop is focused on the essay format, since this is the style of writing you'll do most often in English classes. In part 1, we covered the sentence level, and in this part 2, we'll be covering the entire essay, the essay as a whole. So we've moved from local into global thinking in this workshop. So at the global level, we're thinking about the essay as a whole rather than as a series of sentences and paragraphs brought together on a page. Remember, you are writing an essay, so having an idea of what the entire thing is trying to do is helpful. Now, in its most basic form, an essay can be split into 3 parts. All essays have an introduction, an argument, and a conclusion. To break that down into something more detailed is to break down the argument into smaller parts. I prefer 3 parts, but this is by no means a hard and fast thing to follow. And the majority of my own writing has an introduction, 3 subsections, and a conclusion. So the whole essay, all essays start with an introduction, and these are often incredibly mechanical parts of essays. Introductions have a set job in critical writing, providing a basic map of the piece, highlighting what the proposed argument is and how you will make this discussion through examples, significant context the reader ought to bear in mind, and so on. However, this does not mean that introductions have to be boring to write or read. On the contrary, as the first thing read, introductions also have to hook your reader in and get them excited about what they're about to read. A good way to do this is to start with a bold declaration, which can act as a hook that brings the reader in. And having that bold declaration saying what this essay is going to do or how this essay is going to engage with a text does some of that necessary introductory work as well. This bold declaration is called a thesis statement, and it's when you say what your overall argument your essay is going to make. Another thing to consider that is perhaps more useful advice for coursework than it is for exams is to write your introduction last. Now, this might seem counterintuitive since it's the first thing that gets read and sits at the top of the essay, so you would think it would probably make more sense to come first. But if you think about the work that an introduction has to do, it kind of makes more sense to write it last. If the introduction is a map of the entire essay, how would you be able to draw that map before you've sort of been to all those different argumentative places? Like, you're not going to know your overall argument entirely until you've written it. So writing the introduction last allows you to do all that mapping work much more easily. Introductions are a lot easier to write last than they are first because you've done all the work that goes into the introduction already. Since the introduction is quite a mechanical piece of writing with set components, I can outline some here to you. Think of these as some of the necessary beats an introduction ought to hit. First, we have that bold opening statement that makes your reader excited about the prospect of reading the piece. When I say exciting, I don't mean you should be building suspense. Don't write anything like wait and see sentences or coming up in this essay. It's a different kind of excitement that you're trying to create, which is more like reassuring the reader that this is a well thought out piece delivered by someone who has worked hard and is confident in this product that they've made. The mapping sentences are another essential component. They're often sort of this essay will style sentences where you clearly outline the essay's map as in like what you're arguing, what you're doing with the text, how you're reading it, and so on. The next sort of beats to hit are these I will achieve this by style sentences, which signpost evidence you plan to use throughout your argument. When you write these, you should try and just say broadly what moments in a text you'll be referring to, or what aspect of a work you'll be considering in your essay. Since you don't need to go into detail because you'll do that in the main body of the essay. Ensure that these are written according to the structure of your overall essay. Don't write the thing you achieve second in the essay before the thing you achieve first, because that will just be confusing to read, because if you're providing a map, you don't want to say go to site 2 before site 1. It can be a bit too, it's just confusing, yeah. Finally, the introduction needs to be rounded out with some kind of closing or linking sentences. Generally, ending the introduction with your list of evidence does not enthuse readers. No one really gets excited by a list in a written piece, so having something at the end that either returns to the overall argument of the piece, links to the next section, those add something more palatable to end the introduction on, so they tend to be a bit more provocative. So the main argument is the bulk of the essay, where you make a case for your overall argument using specific points and relevant evidence. Since we've discussed this in quite a bit of detail in the part 1 of this workshop, I shall only say that these sections ought to be confidently written and demonstrate a well thought out and clear through line. A through line is a strand of argument that carries through the entire essay. Again, you don't want this to read like a collection of random musings and tangents, but a sustained exercise of your own thought. Continue signposting throughout your essay to keep the cohesion smooth. And finally, remember that you don't have to linearly follow a point, evidence, explain, develop, link structure. If it reads better to start with evidence, go for it. These are key components that you have to try and hit when writing, whilst at the same time ensuring that your writing is clear and makes sense when put together. So again, follow your writerly instinct rather than stick to the rules, as it were. Okay, so at the bottom of your essay, after you've written the whole thing, you have the conclusion. You have to conclude, you have to finish this piece that you've written. Conclusions can feel difficult to write because sometimes it feels like you're wrestling with a big thought and trying to wrap everything in a neat little bow and still at the same time be thought-provoking and interesting. That said, like the introduction, the conclusion has certain beats to hit, which can manage these issues you may have with writing them. I'd describe these beats as a summary statement of the work done in the essay, a wrap-up statement which ties all the points made in the essay back to the thesis statement, and a closing statement which takes the argument to places beyond the contained space of the essay, and finally the bang to end on and really provide that entertaining and thought-provoking close. Now, summary statements are perhaps the easiest and most boring part to write, but they help to wrap that neat little bow on your essay. A good summary statement ought to consist of as few sentences as necessary to summarize what you've been doing throughout the essay. Just remember that your reader's already read the entire essay, so you don't need to go through every single detail you went through already. What you're providing here are broad strokes of your argument that just sort of bring it all back into focus. So, for example, throughout this essay, I have considered the role superstition plays in blood brothers. I have done this by focusing on how superstitious belief falls across class divides, seen by how Mrs. Leon uses Mrs. Johnston's superstitious beliefs to acquire one of her children. Doing so revealed that... So here I'm being intentionally broad in my statements because the reader's just read the essay anyway. There's no need to be detailed in the summary statement. They are there to signal to the reader how all the points you just made fit together in the broader picture of the thesis statement. These statements are also important since they let the reader do less work, which makes them more likely to agree with your argument and lets them really digest and assess that argument. It's a way of sort of bringing everything together and making and sort of providing a bit of relaxation room. Wrap-up statements see your conclusion at moving from summary statement and returning to the thesis statement. With a wrap-up statement, you're directly linking your argument to your thesis statement, drawing a close to the essay, and in doing so, you're pulling the top and the bottom of the essay together by having a wrap-up statement, which further develops cohesion and provides you a way to close down the essay or begin closing it down. I've got an example from my PhD here from a chapter on vampires and glitter. Try and focus on the moments where I wrap up roughly 12,000 words the reader would have just said. So I write, doing so revealed a traceable network of luminescence between a range of literary and cinematic vampires where sparkles, glows, and brightness are used at specific moments of heightened vampiric effect. Vampiric luminosity occurs when they rise, feed, and turn. Of particular interest here is the connection that glowing bodies have to femininity and queerness, as women and queers have a particular affinity for the sparkly stuff. This therefore suggests that vampiric luminosity visually communicates not just heightened vampiric effect, but an affect that is charged with femininity and queerness. So I'm doing so as a way of saying, this is how I've done this, and this is what it's revealed and brought our attention to in this essay, and then I've provided a sort of brief summary of what the sort of key points of my argument were and how the things link together. So it's sort of where in the summary statement you're providing a sort of tourist sightseeing view of the text that you went through and the sort of key points you're making. This is talking about your argument's key points instead, and wrapping those up neatly and bringing it back to whatever you wrote in the introduction of I will do this by. So now that you've summarized your essay and wrapped up your argument, we move into the closing statement and bang. This is the point where you get to be a little bit more creative by sending your provocations beyond the immediate area of the essay. A high-level argument is one that applies beyond the evidence used in that essay. A good closing statement will suggest where the line of thinking being pursued in the essay can go. This can be a suggestion that applying your reading to other parts of the text may offer fresh analysis, or considering other writing in that text genre or that author's work. Here you're trying to go beyond what you've outlined in the above essay to again reaffirm that your idea is not isolated to a few lines in one book, but somehow goes beyond to other parts of the book, the author's bibliography, other writers in the same time period, or anywhere of sort of similar relevance. The very end, the bang, is characterized as a swift rhetorical flourish. This doesn't necessarily add anything to the work in terms of argumentation, but a good bang, a good closing sentence can make your writer go ooh or whoa. It can sort of make them feel good and satisfied with your essay, and that can be good for you. Ending on a bang can improve the reader's reading experience, which in these assessed contexts can turn literally into higher marks. So it's always worth trying to sort of end on some kind of like witty, rhetorical statement which is still relevant to your argument, but is more designed to provoke a sort of feeling in the reader than it is to do anything else. So here is another example from my thesis, from the glitter chapter I cited earlier. This is my ending bang. It's really long because it's a 12,000 word chapter, and I won't read it out because I don't really need to for this example, but the banging point, the sort of rhetorical flushes can be seen in sentences like vampires' glows can be used for celebratory queer expression and to queerly agitate. It's a way of sort of quick, memorable phrases which are really where you get to sort of flex your writing ability, your writerly instincts necessarily rather than your argumentative ones. So in the introduction to this chapter, I talk about like lighting structures in Gothic texts and how there is this tendency towards gloomy lighting, which is called gloom in these 18th century works I'm talking about at that point. So then I sort of wittily draw it and my like queer thread together by saying whilst gloom might not be very fierce, the Gothic has easy and regular access to other forms of mood lighting. It's drawing everything together and trying to be a bit stylish about the argument being made. So that is the global way of thinking about an essay, of thinking about it as a coherent piece of everything that comes together. These are just some final tips, pieces of advice, and definitions of terms we've come across throughout this two-part workshop. So on this page we have some definitions. Active voice refers to phrasing which makes the work feel more alive and also saves words. It's more preferable to the passive voice in almost all contexts. It makes sentences feel more alive, it makes them feel more pleasant to read and less sort of like convoluted. An example for these two voices would be beautiful giraffes roam the savannah for the active voice. You have this image of giraffes moving along the savannah, and then the passive voice would be the savannah is roamed by beautiful giraffes. So in that example, it's a sort of still image rather than something mobile and active and alive. A thesis statement, a term I've been using throughout, refers to your overall argument in a given work, stated boldly in the introduction. Signposting refers to phrases that link parts of your arguments together. Signposting establishes cohesion, and it's as simple as using specific sort of phrases like, as discussed earlier, which I shall cover shortly, and discuss towards the end of the essay. This workshop has mainly focused on the written and rhetorical skills that can be developed for essay writing. I will now close out the workshop with some final tips, notes on editing, and suggestions, suggesting you create a work in progress group with your friends or classmates. The first thing to remember is that you are not writing prose. The genre you're writing in is important and dictates the writing conventions you should try and follow when writing. For essays, you do not need to write in elaborate, flowery, or complex ways. The work of a critical essay is to explore a concept. As such, flowery language does nothing more than obscure your argument. The effect this has is that your reader might not know what you're talking about, which parts of the essay are important, and this can turn into reduced marks. Clean, neat language is often better for essays. The next thing to remember is to think of your reader. Who is reading this essay? Why are they reading it? How are they reading it? So if you think of your teachers, imagine that they're reading this essay because it's coursework. They're likely reading it during or after work alongside a lot of other essays on the same topic. And ask yourself, how would you feel reading the 13th essay on the same thing? What would you want from that kind of work? Thinking of your reader and the context in which they read is really important. On that note, also, you should think of your reader as less informed than you. Assume they know less about the text than you. They certainly know less about your argument than you do. With that in mind, add description when necessary, explain at length when appropriate. Do not take shortcuts or assume knowledge. Take your time and let points breathe. And finally, one thing I do when I do my writing is I turn my word count off. Having a word limit and approaching it halfway through an essay can cause you to hastily write out points you want to make, weakening those ideas. If you can't see the word count, you can't get anxious about how much space you have left. Let yourself write about a point until you're satisfied that you have explained it fully, that you have completely emptied that point out of your head. You can cut unnecessary stuff during editing. On that note, if you're watching this video before exams, this and the next slide will not be of any use. There's little time to do any kind of editing in an exam setting. This is more for coursework where a deadline may be weeks or days away. Editing is my favourite part of writing, getting that first draft in all its messiness and cutting, rearranging and fixing your expressions into something more concise, precise and that flows with ease just really appeals to me personally. On the previous slide I said that you should try and fully empty your head of a point, and editing is why. It's so much easier to cut down than it is to pad out. You're 800 words under word count and have nothing left to say versus you're 400 words over and could stand to lose that bit there, trim that sentence there. Being creative, creating words, is harder than fine-tuning at creation, something you've already made, and just sort of improving it. If you have time, leave a piece of writing for a few days, ideally 2 weeks, before returning to it. Letting time pass makes you less intimate with your writing, allowing you to identify unclear expression and when you're glossing over points more easily. For this reason, it's also good to have a second reader and get their feedback. Consider a work in progress group, which I'll quickly outline in the next slide, as well. Finally, there's a difference between editing by hand and editing on a screen. Our reading and thinking behaviours differ between media, with each version having pros and cons. Editing on a screen is often faster, so it's good for quick fixes like addressing typos. Editing by hand makes you think slower and process more deeply, so it's good for really clearing up muddled bits of writing. So use both or a mixture of the two depending on the time available and what kind of editing you're trying to do. Work in progress. In our PhD cohort, we have work in progress sessions every 2 weeks. Up to 3 students submit partial drafts of their current work for group feedback. We read it in our own time, annotating with questions, comments and suggestions for improvement, notes on what we did and didn't like, and all this develops the very useful skill of getting comfortable with presenting unfinished work, and has the benefit of having a group of people act as beta readers. They are all fresh pairs of eyes for your work and can spot errors you don't, or say they like things that you might think are clunky or bad. It also makes thinking of your reader and writing accordingly become second nature and helps embed and foster good writing and critiquing practices. This is something to consider setting up with your classmates or friends, and they're often great environments for developing knowledge and skills in a group setting. This slide is the link to part 1 of the workshop, which focuses on local local level writing and rhetorical skills development. It looks at language and sentence structure as well as paragraph structure, whereas this one focused mainly on the essay as an entire sort of as a single piece of work. So go to that one if you're looking for a workshop on sentence and language structure and developing paragraphs and those sorts of things. Here's the information for that. Okay, so thank you for watching, listening, and participating in this workshop. If you're interested in learning more about what it's like to study English literature and/or creative writing at university, you can start with our website. Feel free to contact us with questions as well, with all the contact information being presented on the slide in front of you. Thank you for coming to this two-part workshop on writing and rhetorical skills, and I hope it's helpful for your essay writing at school.